Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of a mystery that has lingered in the humid air of North Carolina for decades. We are traveling back to a summer that felt endless, to a place where the history of a great university meets the quiet, unyielding stillness of the woods. It was the afternoon of June 30th, 1965. The sun hung heavy over Chapel Hill, a brilliant, burning orb that turned the sky into a shimmering shade of Carolina blue. The heat was a tangible thing, a thick, sweet blanket smelling of scorched grass and ripening honeysuckle. On the campus of the University of North Carolina, the rhythm of life had slowed to a crawl. The bustling crowds of the spring semester had vanished, replaced by the sparse, leisurely movements of summer students. The red brick walkways, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, radiated the midday warmth, and the great oaks offered pools of deep, velvet shadow that felt like a sanctuary from the glare. In this suspended moment, the air was filled with the rhythmic, hypnotic drone of cicadas, a sound that seemed to vibrate within the very trees themselves. It was a day made for slow movements and soft voices, a day where the world felt safe, wrapped in the golden haze of a southern summer. Walking through this golden afternoon was Suellen Evans. She was 21 years old, a young woman with a future that stretched out before her as bright and clear as the summer sky. Suellen was a student of home economics, a major that reflected her organized, thoughtful nature. She had a gentle presence, often seen carrying her books with a quiet determination. On this particular Wednesday, she had finished her classes around midday, her mind likely drifting toward her plans for the coming weekend. She was preparing to travel back to her family home in Mooresville, a prospect that surely brought a smile to her face as she navigated the familiar paths of the campus. She wore a blue and white striped shift dress, one she had carefully crafted herself, with delicate red piping along the collar. It was a garment that spoke of her skill and her eye for detail. As she stepped out of the cool, paper-scented halls of her classroom building, the transition to the outdoor heat was sudden. She paused for a moment by the old well, perhaps catching a faint breeze, before beginning her walk toward Cobb Dormitory. She was a solitary figure in a landscape of academia, her footsteps a light, rhythmic tapping on the pavement, unaware that the route she chose would soon become a part of the university's darkest lore. To reach her dormitory more quickly, Suellen decided to take a shortcut through the Coker Arboretum, a 5-acre expanse of botanical beauty nestled in the heart of the campus. The Arboretum was a place of transition, where the structured elegance of the university buildings gave way to a more wild, overgrown landscape. It was a labyrinth of narrow, winding gravel paths, shaded by towering trees and screened by dense thickets of flowering shrubs and tangled vines. As she stepped off the main thoroughfare and entered the garden, the sounds of the campus began to fade. The distant hum of occasional traffic and the muffled voices of other students were replaced by the profound, ancient silence of the woods. The air here was different, cooler, damp with the scent of wet earth, moss, and the heavy fragrance of blooming gardenias. The light was filtered, falling in long, dusty shafts through the canopy, creating a dappled mosaic of gold and green on the forest floor. It was a place often used by lovers for its privacy, a scenic refuge that felt miles away from the rigors of study. Suellen moved deeper into this emerald sanctuary, her sandals crunching softly on the gravel, moving toward the Raleigh Street exit. The shadows here were longer, more intricate, clinging to the trunks of the pines and the sprawling roots of the ancient crepe myrtles. The path she took was one she had walked many times before, a familiar thread through the green heart of the school. But on this afternoon, the stillness of the Arboretum held a different quality. The cicadas seemed to grow louder, their buzzing a constant, pressing wall of sound that masked the smaller noises of the forest. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle tension that rippled through the leaves. Near the vicinity of the Forest Theater, the woods grew particularly dense. It was here, amidst a bed of periwinkles and wild flowers, that the peace of the afternoon was shattered. An unseen figure, a man who had been lurking in the deep shadows of the undergrowth, suddenly stepped into her path. The encounter was a violent interruption of the summer's calm. Suellen, despite the suddenness of the attack, fought back with a fierce and desperate strength. She was not a passive victim. She was a woman fighting for her life in a place that should have been her home. The struggle was brief but intense, a chaotic flurry of movement against the static beauty of the garden. In the heat of the struggle, the assailant produced a sharp instrument, a blade that caught the filtered light for a terrifying second before it found its mark. The silence of the park was broken by a scream, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the drone of the insects and reached out toward the world beyond the trees. The scream reached the ears of those nearby, a few students walking on the periphery and 2 nuns who were on campus for summer classes. They ran toward the sound, their hearts pounding in rhythm with their hurried footsteps. When they reached the path, they found Suellen collapsed on a bed of trampled periwinkles. Her blue and white dress was torn, the vibrant colors now stained with the deep, tragic crimson of her life's blood. The attacker was gone, vanished back into the labyrinth of greenery as if he were a ghost born of the shadows. As the rescuers knelt beside her, the air felt impossibly still. Suellen, struggling for breath in the heavy humidity, managed to speak her final words. She whispered of the horror she had just faced, a soft, fading admission of the struggle before she lost consciousness. The nuns attempted to provide comfort, their voices low and urgent in the quiet woods, but the wound to her heart was too deep. By the time the authorities arrived and the sirens began to wail in the distance, the life that had been so full of promise only minutes before was slipping away. The golden light of the late afternoon continued to filter through the trees, indifferent to the tragedy on the forest floor. The Arboretum, once a shortcut of convenience and beauty, was now a crime scene, its silence heavy with a mystery that would remain unsolved for over 50 years. As the sun began to set on that June day in 1965, the university was left to grapple with a loss that would haunt its paths forever. The sisters reached the edge of the gravel path, where the manicured lawns of the university gave way to the tangled, emerald embrace of the Coker Arboretum. The air here was heavy, thick with the cloying sweetness of blooming honeysuckle and the cool, damp breath of earth that had been shielded from the midday sun by a dense canopy of ancient oaks and weeping willows. Their habits caught on the low-hanging branches of the shrubbery as they moved, the sound of their frantic footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of fallen pine needles and decaying leaves. When they found her, the world seemed to tilt and slow into a silent, horrifying tableau. Suellen lay upon a bed of violet periwinkles, her light-colored, homemade shift dress torn and stained with a deep, visceral red that looked almost black against the pale blue fabric. The heat of the North Carolina afternoon felt suddenly oppressive, a physical weight pressing against the lungs of everyone present. One of the sisters knelt in the dirt, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the cooling skin of Suellen's hand, seeking a pulse that was faint and erratic, like the desperate fluttering of a moth against a window pane. As the 2 female students caught up, breathless and pale, they saw the scene through a haze of shock. The Arboretum, usually a place of quiet reflection and academic solitude, had been transformed into a site of jagged, incomprehensible violence. Suellen's books and personal belongings were scattered across the dirt and trampled flowers, a tragic scattered map of the life she had been leading just moments before. She had been on her way to her dormitory to pack for a weekend trip home to Mooresville, her mind likely filled with the mundane thoughts of a college freshman finishing her summer session. Now she looked up at them with eyes that were clouded by the onset of shock. With a voice that was barely more than a ragged whisper, she uttered words that would haunt the community for decades. She told those leaning over her that a man had tried to rape her, and then, with a heartbreaking simplicity, she whispered that she believed she was going to faint. The sisters attempted to perform artificial respiration, their movements rhythmic and desperate, while the scent of crushed petals and metallic blood rose around them in the stagnant summer air. The silence of the campus was shattered minutes later by the wail of sirens, a sound that cut through the humid afternoon like a blade. Police Chief William Blake arrived to find a scene of chaos and profound sorrow. The paramedics moved with a practiced, somber urgency, lifting Suellen from her bed of periwinkles and rushing her toward North Carolina Memorial Hospital, but the damage was too severe. A sharp instrument, believed to be a knife with a long, thin blade, had found its mark in her neck and her heart. Back at the Arboretum, the investigation began in earnest under the flickering shadows of the trees. The police cordoned off the area with yellow tape that fluttered listlessly in the occasional breeze, while bloodhounds were brought in to catch a scent. The dogs strained at their leashes, their low bays echoing off the brick walls of nearby buildings as they tracked a trail from the site of the struggle toward a nearby church, only to lose the scent as it reached the hard, hot pavement of the public road. The transition from a sanctuary of learning to a crime scene was complete, leaving a chilling void where the peace of the afternoon had once resided. Word of the attack rippled outward from the Arboretum like a stone dropped into a still pond. In the dormitories, young women who had left their doors unlocked for years suddenly felt the click of the latch as a vital necessity. The description of the suspect began to circulate, passed from lip to lip with a mixture of hope and dread. He was described as a young man, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a slender, athletic build and pockmarked skin. He had been seen wearing a light blue sports shirt with the tails hanging out, and witnesses recalled seeing a dark-skinned arm reaching out from the bushes during the struggle. The police questioned everyone they could find: janitors, gardeners, and passing students. One groundskeeper was brought in for questioning, but the weight of the accusation was so great that he fainted repeatedly under the pressure of the interrogation. Every lead seemed to melt away like the summer mist. The search for the weapon became an obsession. Authorities believed that if they could only find the knife, they could find the man who held it. They looked in the tall grass, under the thick vines of the botanical gardens, and in the dark recesses of the campus drainage pipes, but the earth surrendered nothing. By the following week, the search had grown into a massive, community-wide effort. 200 men, many of them students and local residents, volunteered to scour every inch of the Coker Arboretum. They gathered in front of Graham Memorial, dressed in old clothes and sturdy boots, forming a long, grim line that moved shoulder to shoulder through the brush. They used sticks to part the thickets and flashlights to peer into the hollows of trees, their eyes searching for any glint of steel or discarded evidence. The atmosphere in Chapel Hill was one of collective mourning and simmering fear. The Dean of Women issued a formal warning, urging every female student to never walk alone and to avoid isolated areas of the campus entirely. The university, once a place where freedom and exploration were encouraged, was suddenly a landscape of boundaries and forbidden paths. As the sun began to set on those long, hot July days, the shadows of the Arboretum seemed to stretch further than they ever had before, swallowing the light and leaving the town to wonder who was walking among them, hidden in plain sight, carrying a secret as sharp and cold as a switchblade. As the 200 men finished their search, and the police files began to thicken with hundreds of dead-end leads, the initial frantic energy of the investigation began to settle into a heavy, lingering unease. The reward fund, raised by the students, climbed to over $1,200, but even that substantial sum failed to coax a witness from the shadows. The suspect had vanished into the humid night of 1965, leaving behind only the memory of a scream and a bed of trampled periwinkles. In the weeks that followed, the students of Chapel Hill tried to return to their studies, but the silence in the library felt different now, and the walks between classes were hurried, filled with frequent glances over the shoulder. The summer of 1970 would later be remembered for many things, but for those who were there in the mid-60s, the specter of Suellen Evans remained a permanent fixture of the landscape. Every rustle in the leaves and every footstep on the gravel was a reminder that the safety of their small world had been shattered, and that somewhere, the person responsible was still breathing the same sweet, heavy air of the Carolina summer. The air on that afternoon in late July, 1965, was a thick, stagnant weight. It pressed down on the rolling hills of the university campus with the humid insistence of a North Carolina summer, a heat that seemed to muffle the sounds of the world. In the shadows of the Forest Theater, the stone tiers of the amphitheater felt cool against the rising temperature. But just beyond them, the Coker Arboretum was a riot of green. It was a place of deep, tangled beauty, where wisteria vines wound like serpents around the trunks of ancient trees, and the sweet, cloying scent of blooming flowers hung heavy in the stillness. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patches, shifting slowly as the clouds drifted overhead, creating a kaleidoscope of gold and gray on the forest floor. It was within this emerald sanctuary, where the path was narrowed by thickets of crepe myrtle and low-hanging branches, that the ordinary rhythm of a summer Friday was shattered. The birds that usually chirped in the brush fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the gravel path, until that peace was replaced by a sudden, jarring violence that the trees would keep secret for decades. As the investigators began to piece together the moments leading up to the tragedy, they turned their attention to those who had been near the theater and the gardens during that fateful lunch hour. One female student, perhaps pausing to catch her breath in the stifling heat, reported a sight that would haunt her dreams. Through the dense tapestry of ivy and leaves, she caught a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of a struggle. She described seeing a dark arm, not just tanned by the sun, but truly dark, wrapped firmly around a woman's legs. It was a brief, fragmented image, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye as the assailant fled into the thicket. Another witness, a workman near the campus edge, noticed a man emerging from the greenery, running with a desperate, frantic energy toward the busy intersection of Franklin Street. This man was described as being approximately 20 years old, standing about 5 feet 10 inches tall, and weighing roughly 160 pounds. He was slender but possessed an athletic grace, moving through the shadows with a speed that suggested he knew the terrain well. He wore a light blue sports shirt and dark brown trousers, a mundane outfit that allowed him to melt into the Friday afternoon crowd once he reached the sidewalk. In the days that followed, the police worked tirelessly with these fragmented memories to create a composite sketch, a charcoal ghost of the man they believed was responsible. The sketch depicted a figure with a stocky build and a face marked by the shadows of pockmarks or acne scars, details that gave the stranger a rugged, weathered appearance. His eyes were described as dark and piercing, hidden behind the veil of the sketch's gray lines. This image was printed in newspapers across the state, the ink staining the fingers of thousands of readers who looked at the face and wondered if they had passed him on the street or seen him lingering near the university wall. There were reports of a man matching this description who had been seen on campus before, often wearing dark sunglasses and watching the students pass by from the edges of the gardens. He was a phantom who existed in the periphery, a stranger who seemed to belong nowhere and everywhere at once. The sketch was pinned to precinct walls and distributed to every officer, a silent, staring reminder of the void at the center of the case. The forensic science of 1965 was a world away from the digital precision we know today. In the heat of the crime scene, detectives knelt in the dirt, their suits damp with perspiration, as they carefully poured white plaster of Paris into the few footprints they found near the bed of periwinkles. They waited in the heavy silence for the liquid to harden, hoping the resulting casts would reveal a unique wear pattern or a specific brand of shoe. They collected Suellen's blue-striped shift dress, carefully folding the fabric that still held the scent of her perfume and the dust of the arboretum. They took scrapings from beneath her fingernails, gathering the tiny, microscopic traces of the fight she had put up. In a modern laboratory, these samples would have been a goldmine of genetic information, but in the mid-60s, they were merely physical artifacts that could not yet speak. Bloodhounds were brought to the scene, their long ears sweeping the ground as they strained against their leashes. But the heavy summer air and the scent of 1,000 flowers seemed to confuse them. The trail simply vanished at the edge of the stone theater, as if the stranger had stepped off the face of the earth. The investigation cast a wide net, pulling in dozens of men who fit the vague descriptions provided by the terrified witnesses. One suspect was a groundskeeper who worked near the campus. When he was brought into the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room and asked about the events in the garden, he reportedly fainted multiple times, overwhelmed by the gravity of the questions. Another man was seen leaving the area in a late-model Rambler, his clothes stained with what appeared to be blood. Yet he too slipped through the fingers of the law after providing an explanation that could not be disproven. There were over 200 leads followed, stretching from the small towns of North Carolina all the way to Texas, each one a thread that seemed to promise a resolution before snapping under the weight of scrutiny. The limitations of the era meant that without a confession or a murder weapon, which was never found despite hundreds of men searching shoulder to shoulder through the brush, the case began to settle into a quiet, frustrated stalemate. The stranger remained just that. A trace, a sketch, a shadow moving through the trees, leaving behind only the cold stone of the theater and a silence that no amount of questioning could break. As the humidity of 1965 surrendered to the crisp, morning air of autumn, the frantic energy of the investigation began to settle like dust on the windowsills of the Chapel Hill Police Department. The initial roar of activity, the hundreds of men scouring the Coker Arboretum, the barking of bloodhounds through the thick vines, and the constant chime of telephones, faded into a steady, rhythmic silence. Chief William D. Blake sat at his desk, the weight of nearly 100 investigated suspects leaning heavily against his shoulders. Each name in the file represented a face, a story, and ultimately, a dead end. The vibrant greens of the Arboretum, where Suellen had walked her final steps, turned to brittle browns and deep oranges, the periwinkles she fell upon disappearing beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. The physical world moved forward, but for those inside the precinct, time felt stuck in that mid-afternoon heat of July 30. Every morning, the composite sketch of the man in the light blue sport shirt stared back from the corkboard, his pockmarked face and dark brown trousers rendered in flat, unblinking ink. The investigators could almost smell the metallic tang of the blood that had been spilled. Yet the man who had carried the switchblade seemed to have evaporated into the very North Carolina mist that rose from the ground at dawn. By the time the calendar turned to 1970, 5 years of silence had accumulated. The case files were no longer loose papers on a desk, but were now bound in heavy, tan folders, tucked into the dark recesses of metal filing cabinets that groaned whenever they were opened. That year, a flicker of hope arrived from as far away as Odessa, Texas. The detectives heard whispers of a man who claimed to know the identity of the killer, someone who had lived in Raleigh and spoke too freely in the dim light of a roadside bar. The investigators traveled across state lines, their hearts thumping with a renewed, desperate rhythm. They sat in small, cramped rooms under the hum of fluorescent lights, listening as the lead unfolded. But the hope was a cruel mirage. It was discovered that the man was merely repeating tales he had read in the pulp true crime magazines of the era, weaving fiction into the fabric of a real tragedy. The disappointment was a cold, physical weight. They returned to North Carolina as the seasons continued their indifferent cycle, passing the campus where new generations of students walked the same gravel paths, unaware of the ghost who walked among them. The world was changing. The music was louder, the hemlines shorter, but the box containing Suellen's blue-striped shift dress remained untouched, its red piping still vibrant in the darkness of the evidence locker. The years bled into decades, and the men who had first responded to the scene began to feel the passage of time in their own bodies. Lindy Pendergrass, who had been a young patrol officer when the call first crackled over the radio in 1965, rose through the ranks to become the sheriff of Orange County. His hair grayed, and the lines around his eyes deepened, but the memory of the Arboretum remained as sharp as the blade that had ended Suellen's life. He remembered the way the sunlight filtered through the crepe myrtle trees and the specific, haunting sound of the wind through the leaves. In the mid-70s, the family suffered another blow when Suellen's father, Glenn, passed away in 1975. He had been a postman, a man of routine and steady footsteps, who had spent 10 years waiting for a knock on the door that never came. He died without knowing why his daughter was taken, his heart perhaps simply worn thin by the unanswered questions. 20 years later, in 1995, her mother Rachel followed him, leaving behind a legacy of quiet endurance. The generation that had loved Suellen most was fading away, their voices softening into the rustle of old photographs, while the killer, if he still lived, remained a shadow in the periphery of a much older world. As 1997 approached, 32 years had passed since the afternoon in the garden. The investigation was now a skeletal thing, revived only by the occasional cold case review. Detectives reached back into the past, pulling out the yellowing statements and trying to find something they had missed. They tracked down a long-time suspect, a man who had once been a primary focus of the early search, and sat him down for another interview. They watched his face, looking for a flicker of guilt, a slip of the tongue, or the shadow of a memory. But the man provided a solid alibi, his life now too far removed from the 1960s to offer any new truths. Another prime suspect, a man who had long occupied the minds of the police, was already deceased, taking his secrets to a grave that offered no confession. The technology of the world had transformed. The old teletype machines were gone, replaced by the hum of computers and the promise of forensic science that was still in its infancy. The scrapings from beneath Suellen's fingernails, collected with such care in 1965, sat in their small containers, waiting for a future that might finally be able to read the secrets held within their microscopic fragments. Inside the evidence room, the silence is thick and heavy, smelling of old cardboard and the faint, sweet scent of aging adhesive. There is a profound stillness here, where the objects of a life interrupted are preserved in a state of permanent waiting. Suellen's books, the ones she was carrying to her dorm to pack for her trip home to Mooresville, sit stacked together, their spines cracked and their pages beginning to brittle at the edges. The blue-striped dress she had sewn with her own hands is folded neatly, its fabric holding the phantom shape of a young woman who was only 21 years old. Out in the Arboretum, the crepe myrtle trees have grown tall and gnarled, their bark peeling away in thin, paper-like strips. The university has expanded, new buildings of brick and glass rising up around the edges of the green space, and the sound of laughter and rushing students fills the air every day. Most who walk past the Raleigh Street exit do not know that the ground beneath them once held a secret so dark it changed the campus forever. They do not see the invisible lines of the old investigation, or the way the shadows seem to linger just a moment longer under the thick canopy of trees where the light struggles to reach the forest floor. The transition from the dusty, paper-scented silence of the archive to the clinical chill of a modern forensic laboratory is a journey across decades of human hope. Here, the air is thin and sterile, scrubbed clean by high-efficiency filters that hum with a low, constant vibration, like a mechanical beehive. The light is different here, too. It does not lean through windows in golden slants. Instead, It falls from the ceiling in a flat, unrelenting white that leaves no room for shadows to hide. On the stainless steel surfaces, there is a profound sense of potential. We are no longer just looking at the past. We are trying to touch it with the precision of a needle. In the center of this brightness, the investigators lay out the remnants of a Friday afternoon in July, 1965. The contrast is jarring. The artifacts are organic, worn, and deeply personal, resting against the cold, unfeeling backdrop of 21st century technology. There is a specific kind of reverence in the way a technician snaps on a pair of nitrile gloves, the sound of latex against skin, before reaching for a box that has been sealed since before many of the people in this room were even born. They are looking for the invisible, the microscopic traces of a man who vanished into the foliage of the Coker Arboretum over 50 years ago. The most haunting piece of the archive is a blue-striped shift dress. It is a simple garment, yet it speaks volumes of a life interrupted. Suellen had made this dress herself, her fingers guiding the fabric under the rhythmic pulse of a sewing machine, perhaps thinking of her upcoming trip home to Mooresville. You can still see the red piping along the collar, a small, bright detail that shows her care, her personality, and her youthful eye for fashion. When you look at the fabric now, it is impossible not to imagine her walking through the Arboretum at 12:30 in the afternoon, the humidity of a North Carolina summer clinging to the cotton. The dress is more than evidence. It is a map of a struggle. Forensic experts lean over it now with magnifying lenses, searching the weave for something the investigators of 1965 could never have seen. They look for the transfer of skin cells, for a stray hair, for a single drop of something that might contain the genetic blueprint of the attacker. The fabric holds its secrets tightly, the fibers stiffened by time, yet it remains the most direct link to the man who stepped out from behind the crepe myrtles. Every stitch she placed in that dress is a witness to her final moments, a silent testament to a 21-year-old woman who fought with everything she had. Beyond the clothing, there are tiny, unassuming vials containing the scrapings from beneath Suellen's fingernails. In 1965, these were collected with the foresight of a medical examiner who knew that Suellen had resisted her assailant. For decades, these scrapings were nothing more than debris in a bottle, but today, they are the holy grail of the investigation. The process of extracting DNA from such old samples is a slow, agonizingly delicate dance. The scientists use chemical washes to break down the cellular walls, hoping to find a viable strand of code that has survived the heat and the damp of the passing years. The laboratory is filled with the soft clicking of pipettes and the rhythmic whirring of centrifuges. It is a world of extreme patience. They are looking for a profile to upload into the vast, digital webs of modern genealogy. They dream of a match that leads to a name, a family tree, or a face. They are chasing a ghost through a forest of data, hoping that the physical resistance Suellen offered in that garden left behind a permanent mark, a biological signature that can finally be read by eyes equipped with the power of the future. As the machines work, the old theories begin to circulate in the mind once more, refreshed by the clinical clarity of the room. There was the gardener, a man who worked the grounds near the Arboretum and supposedly matched the vague description of the attacker. The stories say that when he was brought in for questioning, he fainted, not once, but repeatedly, whenever the murder was mentioned. Was it the overwhelming guilt of a secret held too tight, or the fragile nerves of an innocent man caught in a nightmare? Then there was the report of an older man with red hair, seen leaving the area in a 1961 or 1962 Rambler. A witness claimed his shirt was stained with something dark and wet, yet he disappeared into the heavy traffic of Chapel Hill before he could be identified. These names and descriptions are like echoes in a canyon, bouncing back with less and less clarity as the years go by. 200 men once walked shoulder to shoulder through the Arboretum, searching for a switchblade-style knife that was never found. They looked under every leaf and inside every drain, but the weapon, like its owner, seemed to have been swallowed by the earth itself. The Shadow Man of 1965 remains a silhouette, a figure standing just out of reach of the bright laboratory lights. There is a profound, heavy irony in the way we use the most advanced tools of our time to look back at a world of rotary phones and hand-stitched dresses. We are trying to bridge a gap that feels wider than the decades themselves. The investigation has examined over 97 suspects and followed more than 200 leads, stretching from the campus of the University of North Carolina all the way to Texas. Yet the case remains as still as the air in a sealed vault. The modern efforts are a race against the clock of biology. Every year that passes, the samples degrade just a little more, and the witnesses' memories fade into the gray. But there is a reason the files remain open, and why the technicians continue their work with such meticulous care. It is the belief that justice does not have an expiration date. They work for the girl who loved home economics, who was beloved by her parents Glenn and Rachel, and who should have been home in Mooresville by that Friday evening. The archives are not just a graveyard for old crimes. They are a reservoir of unresolved truths, waiting for the one piece of evidence that will finally speak the killer's name into the silence. The air in the Coker Arboretum at the University of North Carolina remains heavy, even after all these years. If you were to walk those paths today, your shoes would crunch softly against the gravel, a rhythmic sound that seems to echo through the towering oaks and the thick, tangled vines of wisteria. It is a place designed for reflection, where the sun filters through the canopy in long, golden needles, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. In the height of summer, the humidity clings to the skin like a damp veil, and the scent of damp earth and blooming gardenias is almost overwhelming. It is a beautiful, curated wilderness, yet there is a stillness here that feels intentional, as if the trees themselves are holding a secret they have guarded since 1965. As you move deeper into the greenery, away from the hum of campus life and the distant chime of the bell tower, the silence deepens. It is here, among the beds of periwinkle and the creeping ivy, that the memory of Suellen Evans lingers most strongly. You can almost feel the weight of the past pressing against the present, a quiet reminder that even the most serene landscapes can harbor shadows that never truly fade. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1965, the heat was sweltering, the kind of oppressive southern heat that makes the air feel thick enough to swallow. Suellen Evans, a 21-year-old student majoring in home economics, was walking through this very arboretum. She was a young woman of talent and grace, wearing a blue-striped shift dress with delicate red piping along the collar, a dress she had meticulously stitched together with her own hands. She had just finished a sociology class and was heading back to her room in Cobb Dormitory to pack her bags for a weekend trip home to Mooresville. It was 12:30 in the afternoon, a time when the world should have felt safe, bathed in the blinding clarity of midday. But as she took her familiar shortcut through the dense foliage, the vibrant colors of her summer day were suddenly fractured. From behind a thicket of crepe myrtle, a shadow emerged. There was no warning, only the sudden, violent intrusion of a stranger. Suellen fought with a ferocity that speaks to her incredible spirit, her blue-striped dress tearing as she struggled against her attacker. She managed to break away, stumbling toward the edge of the path, but the damage had already been done. 2 deep wounds, delivered with a sharp, switchblade-style knife, had claimed her future in a matter of heartbeats. The tragedy of Suellen's final moments is balanced by the immediate kindness of strangers who rushed to her side. 2 nuns, also on campus for summer studies, were among the first to reach her as she collapsed onto a bed of soft purple periwinkles. They knelt in the dirt, their own habits brushing against the trampled flowers as they tried to offer comfort and aid. Suellen's last words were a hauntingly lucid testament to her ordeal. She whispered that a man had tried to harm her, and then, with a quiet finality, she remarked that she believed she was going to faint. She never regained consciousness. The response from the university and the town of Chapel Hill was immediate and massive. 200 men, many of them students and faculty, volunteered to search the arboretum. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human chain that moved slowly through the underbrush, their eyes searching the dirt for a discarded knife or a stray footprint. They wore old clothes and heavy boots, their faces grim as they combed every inch of the 5-acre garden. Despite their efforts, the weapon was never found. The 97 suspects questioned, and the 211 leads followed by investigators all eventually dissolved into dead ends, leaving the case to grow cold as the decades turned into a half-century of silence. Today, if you look closely near the Raleigh Street entrance, you will find a small, modest memorial. It is a plaque, its bronze surface weathered by the rain and the changing seasons, embedded in a stone that seems to have grown out of the earth itself. The letters of her name are raised, cold to the touch, and often surrounded by small tokens left by those who still remember. A stray flower, a smooth stone, or simply the quiet presence of a passerby pausing to read her story. This memorial does not just mark a place of death. It marks a legacy of loss that changed the character of the university forever. Before that July afternoon, the Arboretum was a place of unburdened innocence, a lover's lane where students felt no fear. After Suellen, the gates were watched more closely, and the shadows were viewed with a new, sharp-edged caution. The scholarship established in her memory serves as a living tribute, helping other students achieve the dreams that were so abruptly taken from her. Her father, Glenn, a postal carrier who heard the news while on his route, lived the rest of his life with the weight of this unsolved mystery, as did the community that has never quite forgotten the girl in the blue-striped dress who vanished into the green silence of the trees. As the sun sets over Chapel Hill, the shadows in the Arboretum lengthen, stretching across the gravel paths like long, dark fingers. The mystery of who took Suellen's life remains locked in the past, a secret held by the old oaks and the whispering leaves. There is a somber reality in an unsolved case. It is a story without a final chapter, a wound that never quite heals. Yet, in the quiet of the evening, there is also a sense of peace. Suellen is no longer defined by the violence of that day, but by the beauty she left behind, the memory of her craftsmanship, her ambition to teach, and the enduring grace of the garden that now bears her name in stone. The trees continue to grow, the periwinkles bloom every spring, and the campus moves forward, carrying her memory like a soft, echoing refrain. We may never have the answers we seek, but we can offer her the dignity of being remembered, not as a victim, but as a bright light that once walked these halls. The air grows cooler now, the birds have fallen silent, and the forest is at rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.